I am Gwydion Sullivan. I'm the executive director of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you. Penn Faulkner does programs like this. We give away the Penn Faulkner Award for fiction, the Penn Malamud Award for the short story, and we also run educational programs in DC schools, connecting young readers and with writers from around the region. I want to introduce very briefly to my right, Rion Amilcar Scott, one of our judges for last year's Penn Faulkner Award. Thank you. And the award-winning author of the spectacular story collection, The World Doesn't Require You. Next to Rion is Leslye Penelope, an accomplished author whose debut novel, Song of Blood and Stone, was one of Time Magazine's 100 best fantasy books of all time, not of the year, of all time, which is amazing. And then Zak Salih, who the author of Let's Get Back to the Party, which Oprah recommended as a must-read book in 2021, and she's never wrong. And then we have our amazing moderator, Bethanne Patrick, Penn Faulkner board member, as well as an author and a book critic who is so prolific, I don't know a single person in the literary world who doesn't know and admire the heck out of her, and I'm one of those, and I do. And in our audience, we also have Trisha Elam Walker and Joy Jones, who are with us this afternoon, and Jeffrey Dale Lofton, and this room is full of writers, and it's awesome, so I'm going to turn it over. Thanks.
And I was blown away by what I saw at your school, just blown away. Not just the facility, the caring staff, not just the library that actually focuses on books that show diversity and representation, but those kids, those students. I thought I was going to have, they were going to say, oh, we don't want to go to the writer lady. Because they had a firefighter, they had a football player, they had all of these people. Thank you, that's better. And yet the kids were so involved with the books I had come to show them that I had written. They wanted to see someone who had actually written a book. It really mattered to them. And so for us to support the ARC and Bishop Walker with Penn Faulkner programming, I think is absolutely, it's so exciting and so vital. And tonight we're talking about Voices of DC. And another thing that I want to make sure, I swear I will stop talking about Bishop Walker in a second, but one of the things I really love about the school is that it's not based just on academic achievement, because people with academic skills aren't the only ones who make up a community's leadership. And so we have here 3 writers who are all fiction authors, but their books are so different, their strengths are so different. And we're going to talk about the way DC is made up of so many different kinds of communities, literary and otherwise. So thank you, welcome. And one of the first things, of course, I have to say tonight is I don't know if we're going to talk about Twitter or not. But I think there's some kind of variation of how many Twitter engineers does it take to change a light bulb. I don't have the answer, I don't have the punchline, but you know, it's kind of a crazy week out there. Fortunately, we're here and we can talk about books instead. So let's start, my lovely authors, with the DC metro region. And I'm going to ask each of you to describe it as it is today and what makes it vital and dynamic to you. So, Zak, I'm going to just throw it on you because you're right to my left.
Well, in my experience, I mean, growing up here, I've spent my whole life in this area. I grew up in Northern Virginia. I've lived in D.C. properly for, I think, 10, 12 years at this point. It is ever-changing, I think is a word I would use to describe that. And I think that can be both exciting to see and I think concerning. It's just a very, the rate at which change happens, the things that change, the people that change, the way things are changing. It's just, change has been a constant in my experiences of this
Very
city.
interesting. I like what you said about, change being a constant, but it's not good or bad per se. It's just really fast. How about you, Leslye?
I think that as much as it changes, it's also known for being fairly stable, in terms of people having government jobs. They come and they go with administrations, but a lot of the on the ground workers, my family members who have been in government jobs for many years find it to be stable. But yeah, there's that aspect of it that is a kind of a microcosm of the country in terms of the way that it changes and the way that it's maybe like a canary in the coal mine for things that are going to happen other places, early gentrification, just rioting, things that have gone on in its history, but always staying strong, I think, and staying at the core of the country.
Shout out to the bureaucrats, because I'm married to one, so I like that you brought that up. Thank you. And Rion, how about you?
Yeah, being, now that I live in Annapolis, I find myself sort of outside of it. And when I come back to my old neighborhood in DC, off Georgia Avenue. I used to live on Lamont Street, and it's just like it's kind of like a different place. They're white people walking their dogs. They weren't there when I was there. And it's it feels like it's I think there are three layers in DC. There's official DC where people outside think of DC, and then there's and then there's I don't know, I guess it's Black DC. But then there's this other layer of new people coming in, and I like that my old neighborhood is it's a lot safer. It looks a lot safer than it was when I lived there. I remember I was listening to the TV one time and I wasn't watching it, and they were like, there's been such and such number of shootings in the last week, and I was, man, I'm glad I don't live there. I walk into the room and it's my neighborhood on TV, so it's a lot safer. But I kind of wish there was that level of safety when it wasn't being gentrified.
One of the things I'd like to ask each one of you to do is, because each of your books focuses on a different layer, really, of DC, a different community, is describe whichever book, The World instead of Insurrections, for example, Rion, whichever book you want, describe it as it is today and what part it highlights of a particular community. And Leslye, I'm going to start with you because your book is set furthest in the past tonight.
Right. My book, The Monsters We Defy, is a 1925 fantasy heist that takes place in the U Street area of Washington, D.C.
It is so good, sorry. It's really, really good. You got to read it.
So I wanted to set it, I went to Howard. I spent a lot of time on U Street in the late 90s and discovering how it was in the 1920s and 30s, and when it was Black Broadway and when it was a self-sufficient Black community. I really just wanted to set a story there and show and have that be the part of DC that we focus on. So it's not about the government or the Capitol. That doesn't really enter in at all. It's about this specific place and moment in time when Black people could live and work in amongst themselves and just be, and not really have to touch the outside world unless they did, if they didn't want to. And that's the part of the city I focused on. They called it the secret city. They talk about Black DC, Chocolate City, which I guess is no more. But
no, don't say that.
I don't know. I think we can shed a few tears for Chocolate City. Or maybe we can bring it back. But the secret city, there are many DCs, and Black DC is one of them. That is its own thing outside of what people all over the world probably think about when they think about the nation's capital. And those of us who have a lot of family members from DC. My mom is born and raised in DC. I grew up in Maryland for the most part. But knowing Black DC and loving it, it was an ode to that and the history of that in my book.
Zach?
Yeah, so my novel is set entirely in DC, in the DC region. It takes place in the year between 2015 and 2016. And it is about these estranged childhood friends who reconnect at a gay wedding in Georgetown. And it kind of follows them throughout a year in their life as they kind of flit into and out of each other's lives. What I was trying to do with the book in terms of setting it in a particular time in a community, this isn't a scientific term, but DC is the only place where I've been a practicing homosexual. Writing about the gay community here, not in an authoritative sense, but trying to capture kind of some of the things that I've seen or heard or experienced or felt. It was very important for me to set that story and the experiences of these two characters in this kind of, thought experiment, so to be, of Washington, D.C. Between 2015 and 2016, and to really kind of explore this idea, which is certainly one that I've felt, about what it's like to belong to a certain generation of gay men who have no lived experience of the AIDS plague, but also neither have a real lived experience of living in an increasingly open society.
It's also really great. You have to read it. And I love that the wedding at the opening takes place at Dumbarton Oaks, even though you don't actually name it.
Well, I don't actually say that.
But
Thanks,
it's like, it's so great because it's such a clunky monument to waspy straightness, and here is this gay wedding. It's just wonderful. So no, he didn't say it. You didn't hear it from him. It's just me, okay. Blabbermouth. Rion, would you talk about The World Doesn't Require You, please?
So I take a different tack than my colleagues here. I made up a place, and my place is called Cross River, Maryland. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's an analog for DC, but there's a lot that I take from DC. That area that I used to live in, Lamont Street. If you look very closely, that area, Lamont and Hobart area, is in there. Especially from the 90s. There's a pulsing music in my work called River Beat. And again, it's not an analog for go-go, but it's very close. Cross River kind of is sort of like a mashup of every place that I've known and loved. So from DC proper to Silver Spring, where I grew up, my mother's Port of Spain, Trinidad, where she was raised. I think that actually, what was the question?
We were just talking about which part of DC your work reflects, and that's what you're talking about.
So there's a lot of the culture, the lingo I grew up on. I sort of take that and remix it into Cross River's lingo, their clothes. Everything I imagine about Cross River is or a lot of what I imagine is the culture that I grew up knowing, reflected in a funhouse mirror.
Well, I'm going to continue with you for a second. If I didn't know and read, if I hadn't experienced it through your book, I might say you had too much fun writing it, but I know that there's deep rage against injustice fueling The World Doesn't Require You. But your world building is intricate, and it's sometimes really funny, really wild. So talk to us a little bit about the role that humor plays, or maybe, I don't know, zaniness that it plays in advocating for change. Sorry.
I did have fun writing it, and I have fun with language, I think I'm not going to compare myself to Shakespeare, but when you read Shakespeare, to me the most fun part of Shakespeare is that you could tell that he had a whole lot of fun. Like in Othello, making the beast with two backs. That's a hilarious phrase. That's just a hilarious phrase, and I can imagine him with his quill laughing about that when he came up with that. And so much of my work is very dark. It's there are a lot of dark emotions
Yes.
that I'm evoking, that I'm writing from. It can be hard to live with, and it can be hard to write. And readers tell me that sometimes it's hard to digest. And that's kind of what humor is. It's giving people a chance to have a break. To have a rest and laugh at the absurdity. And I think I think I was gonna tweet this, but I didn't tweet. I guess I forgot. Somebody said something about I do Rion Scott does a good job of writing absurdity. It's like and I'm not writing it. I'm recording the world's absurdity. Right? If you look
Yep.
close enough, it's a lot of things are really really hilarious. Right? You mentioned the collapse of Twitter. A lot of bad things are gonna happen from the people who lost their jobs. A lot of sadness. But it's really funny.
It is.
It's really
It's
fucking
really funny. You can't get. And so this brings me to Leslye. You are writing historical fantasy, and it gives you so much to play with. And so I'm wondering about some of the things maybe that you were able to use to your advantage in bringing in the fantastic elements in your book.
So for the fantasy aspect, I was trying to ground it. I wanted it to be like very historical fiction with this layer of fantastical that's grounded in like African American folk magic. So I wanted to ground it in conjure and that kind of root work, that idea that I thought, that's part of our culture, and bring it forward and have my own spin on it. And because it's so unique and it's so different, and it's different all over the country.
Right.
And so, yeah, that was the idea, to ground that. And so my main character, Clara, is born with a call. So she, aside from all of that, she is able to talk to spirits, and her grandmother is there. Her grandmother's passed away, but has stayed around because Clara obviously needs
Boy, is
guidance.
her grandmother a character.
Yeah. she's around, and she's helpful, and maybe she's around too much. But we have, and then the other layer of magic are the deals that the characters make with spirits. So in this world, you can make a deal with a spirit and you'll get a charm and a trick. And a charm is a power that might be helpful or useful, but the trick is another kind of power, or it's the debt that you owe. It's a negative aspect because everything has that cost to it. And that's
And sorry to interrupt you, but what really interested me here is, as you just said, the power and the trick. This doesn't come from anywhere except Leslye Penelope's head, but then it's woven in with things that are real, like the tradition of calling spirits haints, and other things that come up from African American folklore, as you said. And I thought, talk about having fun when you're writing. I mean, this is, you're talking about a real DC in the 20s. Things aren't by any means easy for Black people. However, you are able, this book was such a pleasure to read. It was, and I don't mean that like pleasure to teach. It was just pure delight, every page. And so I wonder, did you feel that there was anything where you couldn't go, where you couldn't mess with X or Y?
It wasn't that I couldn't. I was writing about the 20s, and I said it in 1925. I said it in August,
Right.
because that's the month when there was a Klan rally. A Klan march down Pennsylvania Avenue, and that it's mentioned in the book. So I want you to know that this is the environment that these characters are living in is very inhospitable to them, to say the least. But they have carved out this place where they're thriving and surviving. And so the antagonists are not racists. That's not the point. So it wasn't that I couldn't go there. I could definitely have written, whatever, but I didn't want to dwell in Black pain. I wanted to write something that was about Black joy in that time period, and focus on other kinds of conflicts. Even though all the characters, it's not, I'm not ignoring it, but people had full lives that were
Right.
that had a lot of variety to them, and so they were dealing with racism, but they were also dealing with just their community and how to make their community more powerful and stronger. And the main antagonist, is fighting against the community, is like trying to destroy that community. So yeah, I wanted to keep it historically accurate. I took a lot of pains to, almost every place that's mentioned is a real place. there's real historical characters that come in, from Langston Hughes to Dr. Carter G. Woodson. They're in the book, and I tried to match the personalities. My idea of the personalities, people might disagree. But yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to focus on, something that was realistic, but also lending or leading towards the hopeful and the joyful, while not ignoring the actual realities that aren't so hopeful.
It's so interesting about how fiction can help us access communities we wouldn't otherwise understand at all. And Zak, in your book, you actually have two main characters who not only are completely different from each other as gay men in Washington, D.C., but who also have completely different ideas about whether or not the presence of gay men, how it should be celebrated or seen or controlled in Washington, D.C. And that comes from what you were telling us about their age and this, after the AIDS crisis and before, the celebration of, everything Pride. And not that any of us would say AIDS is over or that Pride has completely conquered all, unfortunately. But it is a very specific time for your characters, and yet they each couldn't be more distinct in how they feel about their community and how it should. So would you talk a little bit about that in terms of what you were able to use for your story in the community?
Sure, yeah. I mean, chalk it up to being biracial, but I just love putting polar opposites together and seeing what happens. And so one of my characters, just wants to settle down. He wants to get married. For him, this kind of conformity that comes with equality is something he's very open to. There is another character who is literally his polar opposite, and who sees all this kind of conformity or this, this kind of embrace of equality and the pride floats and advertising and such as kind of he loathes it. He sees it as a betrayal to the kind of radicalism that being gay and being queer used to be. And so I really wanted to kind of put these two people up against one another and see what happens. And I think that to me, that made this project very, very rewarding, especially in a city where the neighborhood is constantly changing. It's constantly moving east. I mean,
Where is the
when I was, don't ask me. I'm in my sweatpants at 7 o'clock every night. When I was a kid, from what I recall from stories, it used to be DuPont Circle, right? And so now, as one friend complains to me, there are strollers everywhere in DuPont Circle. When I lived in the quote-unquote neighborhood, it was Logan Circle, so along the 14th Street corridor. Now apparently it's moved east to Shaw, so it's constantly. My joke is that eventually it's going to move so far east that it's going to be in the river at some point. It's just going to be this underground kingdom. But even still, things are changing. Bars open, bars close. I've seen a lot of bars go. There are bars to me that were important places to a lot of people, but. When I kind of quote unquote came around on the scene, they were just names. I mean, I think, and it's sad when you see these kind of spaces, which regardless of whether going to bars is your thing or not, that are still very kind of important to the community and have a very rich communal history. It's always sad to see those places go, and there's something especially malignant about it to me when they're replaced by condos. And I haven't quite figured that out yet. But it seems like if something is going nowadays in DC, it's replaced by condos.
Well, condos and banks, that's all we have.
Condos and banks, yeah, right.
It seems like, but this is interesting what you're saying because, I want to keep talking about your individual books too, but I want to talk also about these different layers in DC and how the literary voices interact. We're here with the three of you, and we recently at our literary State of the Union event celebrated two greats, Susan Shreve and Edward P. Jones, who just make so much of a difference to our literary world here. Amazing. And how do we foster a more dynamic and vital literary world in this we're talking about voices of DC, and we want to lift up all the voices of DC, and we want to lift up voices that have been underrepresented for so long in particular, but there's lots of ways to go about this. So I'm wondering, which of you, who has the magic answer? The killer app for how to do this?
I don't have a magic answer, but I would say it's incumbent on two groups of people. One, it's incumbent on the writers to feel empowered to tell their stories, and it's incumbent on publishers to invest in those stories. I think that that seems to me to be the...
Do publishers, I feel definitely that we are ignored a great deal when it comes to the glittering literary social life that New York publishing has. That's no question. But do you think that voices of DC and DC types of writing also get ignored by the New York media elites?
I wonder if it's ignored, or I was thinking of this as initially a Harlem Renaissance era fantasy heist, and I was going to set it in Harlem, and I'm like, but everything's in Harlem. I'm going to set it in DC because not everything. I don't read enough books about DC. So my publisher didn't have any qualms about that. I think that it's about lifting up writers who are either from here. So many people who have come through here, even if they don't live here in the area now, whether it's through jobs or all the universities, and I don't know what we can do to encourage them, to remind them how great DC is and how it's, just fertile ground for all of these stories throughout history. I mean, the things that I discovered in my research were just so fascinating, but even up until now, all of the political implications, and if you're setting any kind of story that has any type of marginalized character, setting it near where the seat of government is gives you an extra layer on top of that. So on top of the community that's apart from government. So yeah.
That is so true. I mean, come on, perspectives on some of the big things that have happened here, and there are lots of big things that have happened in DC, but Rion, I want to give you a chance to respond as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's no doubt that the industry sort of has a blind spot outside of New York because that's sort of the capital. But I think it's incumbent upon readers to feel like they can, writers to feel like I'm going to write whatever the fuck I want, and I'm not going to, I'm not going to pay, that much attention to the market.
Yep.
And it's not just DC. We need stories about, everywhere, and we need that history. There's a lot of stuff, you said already that I didn't know. Can't wait to read the book. And so, it's, and I feel like, we're coming back outside, and we're meeting each other and seeing each other. And I think it's so important to continue to commune with our institutions, Penn Faulkner and
Yep.
and Hurston Wright and institutions that are doing things in the
Library of
community.
Congress.
Barrel House, right?
Yeah.
That are doing things in the community and to meet people where they are.
Absolutely, and that, I was going to say, actually, I'm glad, Leslye, that you brought up the government. I was going to say it's the elephant in the room, but sometimes the donkey as well. But each of you nod to that in different ways. It can't be ignored when you're writing about DC, as opposed to being a DC writer who might be, writing about something completely different. And so I wanted to ask you each also to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's one of the most wonderful ways so many of the DC writers have contributed to our national literature, is by saying, this is something that's happening in the government and there's something wrong, or there's something really interesting and shiny over here. So whichever one of you would like to take that first.
I guess I could just say in the context of my novel, there is, to borrow from the infamous philosopher, there certainly is a specter hanging over DC, having set this novel between 2015 and 2016, and that is, of course, the election of 2016. Living here, I think, and maybe your experiences are different, but you can't help but be aware that this is the capital of a nation, even though your interests may be so varied and you may never have no interest in setting foot on the National Mall or even looking at the Capitol Dome. That it's you can't divorce the two, I think, or it's if so, it's very difficult, and I haven't learned how to do it.
So my characters haven't set foot in DC.
Right.
Actually, that's not true. The last story in my first book takes place in DC, and it was a fictionalized account of my father's immigration to this country. It took place in the 1960s, and I interviewed him. And the most interesting thing he told me about was about the riot after Martin Luther King was killed, and his sort of tepid participation in that riot. And so my character does that, and I think that yes, the world is going to seep into your work, and in that instance, there may not have been congressmen or anything or presidents, but the sort of the mismanagement of this mismanagement of that event affected me, because 30 years later there was nothing there, and I grew up in watching crumbled buildings, and like, why are these crumbled? Martin Luther King was killed. Like, well, wasn't he killed 16 years before I was born, or however long it was? and 30 years there was nothing there, and so that institutional neglect. I think it's seen in my work. I think the characters see it and feel it, and so we're always influenced by things that happened away from us, whether it's temporally or physically, away from us. Those levers of power being pulled in ways that harm us, and that's that sort of seeps in. It's going to seep into our work.
So for my story, setting it at the time period, in the research I learned so much. Like in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, DC had the highest population of African Americans in the country. Before, that changed after Wilson came in and laws changed and the government was resegregated. But before President Wilson, the government was integrated and Black people had jobs in the bureaucracy. And then that changed. It was resegregated. And so the story takes place, 10 years or so after that had happened. That's all there. That's all part of it. There's people, there were still Black people who had been senators and Congress people alive at that point who might have been present at these social events. There's a lot about classism in the Black community and colorism in the Black community. And in DC at that time, a lot of that was because of who had government jobs in the past and who didn't, and who was a recent migrant from the South during the Great Migration, and who wasn't. There are people who had been in DC for generations, and people who were new, and there's a tension there, and there's all kinds of levels of conflict within the Black community that the characters have to deal with, and so it's not directly related to the government and the president and the Congress, but they're all living as we all do, based on these decisions that have been made that have stripped away power that what once was had in this community, and then that leads to the rioting and disenfranchisement that continues throughout the generations. But I do want to say that I think my experience is a little bit different, because I do know people who live in DC, family members, and it's very separate. It's like you can live here and not care about politics, not follow it, not know about it, because you're living, and especially in like a neighborhood like this, family members who live over like across the river in different parts of the city where it's not top of mind. Survival, life is top of mind, and it just happens to be in the city where the government is. And so there's many DCs, and there's many experiences of DC on many different levels, and it's like great ground from which lots of different stories from those experiences can be told.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that is something a lot of people don't understand about all over the Capital Region, that we don't have a hotline, each one of us, that gives us the news. How many people call all of us, something goes on in the government, what have you heard? I haven't heard anything. I'm in my study writing. I'm not, I haven't, but like you said, someone's working a job. We're not all given all the information all the time. And it's, misconceptions about DC. Now, I know we started a little bit late, and I want to make sure I leave some time for questions, but, it really depends. Are we done at 6:30? Yeah. So I think I would like to open things up for questions that any of you might have. But if you don't, I have a lightning round of questions for our authors that I will pester them with. So, in other words, ask questions.
Hi, my question is for Leslye. I'm just curious about some of the interesting facts or factoids you learned about DC history.
Yeah, I mean, oh goodness. One of the things that fascinated me that ended up in the book was that the alley communities that I didn't know that much about, behind the facades, the beautiful houses in different parts of the city, all across the city actually, there were other communities literally back to back. The person in the front-facing house wouldn't know that there was a house behind them where someone was living essentially in squalor, no plumbing, no electricity, into the 50s and 60s, those types of things. I have stories about like slavery and how the hotels downtown, where they were actually in the basement, places where the property could be held. They were basically slave pens in the basement, so people would come and stay in these beautiful, nice hotels. And then also the great stories about Black Broadway and the Black-owned businesses, the theater company like Sherman Dudley, who is kind of a theater guy. And when I was researching Oscar Micheaux, who is a early Black filmmaker from the silent era into the talkies, I came across this sort of network of Black theater that was all across the country, and it started with like vaudeville and things like that and moved into the movies. And so there were always these micro communities of people thriving and existing and creating media and entertainment for Black people that wasn't necessarily on the radar of other communities. But yeah, the research was really fun and amazing, and I'm sure there's lots of other things. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Okay, this is for all of you or any of you. I was wondering, what do you think the role of fiction is in making an impact in the real world, in social change and social justice? Or is that not what fiction should be doing or thinking about?
And we will be here now, or we can talk about that for a long time, right?
Yeah, I think that the powerful thing about fiction, well, the weakness of fiction is that you're not going to read a book and all of a sudden everyone's reading the book at the same time and they all go out into the streets and gun violence is done and capitalism is falling. That's not going to happen. But it has the novel has the power to ruminate on a lot of different things. It has the power to hold contradictions within itself, and not completely fall apart, and make the individual really think about it and feel think about it in an intellectual and an emotional way. And the short story does a different but similar type of thing, and so I think that every writer needs to write about what is obsessing them, and what's going on in their head, the craziness that's going on in their head, and a lot of that is going to be influenced by the social situation, and so when the individual picks it up, the individual can figure out what they're going to do with it. But if you're trying to force that idea within your story is probably going to fall apart. You have to, especially in the novel, you have to hold weight for contradictions.
Either.
I would just add that I think that the empathy that's created from fiction is the thing that I kind of focus on. So trying to show different characters, and hopefully the reader connects with them and might see this fictional character and then recognize something about them in a real person and think about it differently and just expand their mind in that way also.
Yeah, I think it's a responsibility of the writer to explain and to try and understand and to explore And then I think it's incumbent upon a reader, unfortunately, to do the actual hard work of taking that and putting that into the real world, whatever that may be.
And I'll just say a really interesting thing to bring up Twitter again is I got mildly flamed. I don't know if it was this year or last year. Someone had written an op-ed in The Guardian about the importance of challenging yourself as a reader and challenging yourself with different kinds of books, and sometimes books that are complex and or complicated. And so I put up that op-ed and said, you know, this is really good stuff to think about. And I just got whacked from every side with people saying, don't you talk about reading as being difficult. I read to put myself to sleep. I read for entertainment. I read because I need escape. I read because my life is hard. And I thought, okay, just keep reading. This is just something, you know, but I think what Zak just said actually is really interesting, because a reader chooses how hard to work with reading the novel or the short story. And you can read something, I mean, come on, we all know what this is like. You're 14, you know, you know everything, and you read some great classic and you think, that's it. I've read Maupassant's The Necklace, or I've read The Brothers Karamazov, and I know. And then you read it years later and you realize you knew nothing. It's so I think this is a very interesting thing also, to challenge the literary community, the readers, and all of us are readers, whether we're writers, you know, or not, to push ourselves a little harder, because that's where I think the engagement can come with those social justice issues, is saying, I'm not just going to look at this book as a delight over a cup of tea. I'm going to see what this author is trying to pass along to me. So.
I've lived in only black cities, born and raised in New Orleans, and then Oakland, California, Brooklyn. I live in Baltimore now, and I work here in D.C. My introduction to D.C. has only been Southeast D.C. So whenever I have to venture over to Northwest, where most of our donors come from, I'm always shocked, because I'm like, what is
the cave dwellers.
This is D.C. This is my experience of D.C. And so what do you think D.C., in terms of the contradictions that are exposed or resolved, or the empathy that could be created, what does D.C. have to teach America, you know, other cities? Baltimore's right up the corner, and it's so different. Mm-hmm. What can we learn reading novels that are place-based in D.C. about not only D.C., but about the country?
Great question, and such a big one. Leslye, you look a little, you have a spark there.
It is a good question. I'm thinking about, because I've lived in D.C., I lived in Baltimore, I lived in Oakland, and cities have their own energy, they have their own vibes, and D.C. has a very different feel from Baltimore. That's very true, like to be so close, you know. I think that, yeah, it's hard, because there's so much that goes into what makes up a city, the history, the unique history, and the unique backgrounds of the people who settle there and who stay there and who call it home. And so the stories that I'm trying to tell are a combination of that. Like, I feel like my experience of DC for my family is coming, you know, people who've come from North Carolina and from Memphis and from Virginia and settled here and stayed and brought, you know, all of those stories, those histories, that culture with them, mixed in with everything else. But it is that kind of insular environment that felt very different from Baltimore or Oakland. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I can answer the question, but I think it's all about people. Like, for me, the novels are about the characters, and when the characters are all just interactions, you know, their interactions, they're the experiences that they've had, that their ancestors have had, and that they're raising their children, or, you know, communing with their friends and family, and it's just combining all of those things and trying to find some kind of truth in that's truth for the people, that would be different if they moved somewhere else among a different group of people with a different background. But that's the only thing I can think of.
You know, Leslye talked about empathy. You know, and one of my heroes is Edward P. Jones, and the way he writes about DC and this, you know, down to these very little details, it makes me see the place in such a different way, because it's, it's filtered through his consciousness, and I think that's what's so important about not even just writing about DC. I like communing with other places. So I like picking up a book and reading about long ago New Orleans or something like that. And the author might be of a different culture, and it gives me an opportunity to walk in their shoes. And DC is a particular consciousness, and I think people reading Edward P. Jones, they get one particular consciousness of DC. And reading Leslye, they'll get a different particular consciousness of DC. So to answer your question, I think the beauty of having work that's about DC is the beauty of literature. It gives people the opportunity to walk in the shoes of other people, and the different DCs that are going to be represented in literature are just going to give us different ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, I really like that, the multiplicity of consciousness. And I apologize if this sounds schmaltzy, but everyone has their own very personal idea of what DC is and what it means to them. And in a very beautiful way, I think this means that there is no such thing as, the great DC novel. Mm-hmm. Just as there is no such thing as the great American novel, or no such thing as the great insert, your particular location or subculture novel. There's just like everyone's experience is so unique, and I think, to your point, this is what makes literature so refreshing, is that I'm no longer constrained to just my personal experience of the city or one writer's. I mean, everyone, if they choose to run through that awful gauntlet, could write, their own story about DC. And this is a great thing, because it means that there are so many voices and so many different perspectives and so many books, and who could be mad about that,
Do we have time for questions?
I think we have time for one more quickly answered question. Quickly asked, quickly answered.
Yes. I'd just love to hear anything about the writing process, if a place to write or a time of day to write, what might get your writing juices going.
For me, time of day has to be morning. I've tried the whole staying up till 2 a.m. and doesn't work for me. So yeah, I write every morning. I get up and I write with people. So I write on a Google Hangout with other writers to force me to be there. So if I sleep late, there's someone who's texting me like, "Where are you? You're supposed to be working." But other than that, I try not to have too many things that would hinder me, like I need a special this or a special that, because I just want to be able to, wherever I am, be able to get up in the morning and write and try to meet those deadlines. That's my basic routine, but tea is always involved. Tea is actually very important to my writing process.
Yeah, I've always been a late night writer, which is just so much harder as you get older. But when no one is there to bother me, my kids are asleep. That's when I can think the clearest. But again, if I do that on Monday, that the rest of the week is kind of shot. So I have to actually learn to write other times. So I try to as Leslye said, I try to have no hindrances. Whenever I can sit down and write.
I treat it like a full-time job. I try and write a couple hours. I mean, I do have another full-time job, but I try and write a couple hours every day, Monday through Friday. I take weekends off. I take federal holidays off, and that's just the way that I work. I mean, I grew up thinking that if one is a writer, one has to write every single day for as much as one can. And I think a big sea change that happened for me as a writer was learning that taking a break and thinking about your writing is writing too, so.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. This was fantastic. That was awesome. Go forth, fight the traffic, and win.